This happened about 3 years ago, and I still get chills whenever I think about it. For context, I'm from a mid-sized town in the Pacific Northwest, and back when I was 17, I had a part-time job at a local diner washing dishes and bussing tables. The place was owned by my uncle, and I'd work the closing shift from 6 until midnight most weeknights. The walk home took me about 40 minutes, and the fastest route cut straight through Riverside Park. The park had a weird layout. One main entrance at the south end near the commercial district, and 2 exits at the north end. One northern exit led to an abandoned basketball court, the other to a middle school, and some athletic fields. The whole park was overgrown with dense hedges and old oak trees, and the lighting was terrible. And most of the lights shut off automatically around 11:30, leaving only the dim street lamps at each entrance. I'd been taking the same route home for almost 8 months, which I now realize was incredibly stupid. I'd leave the diner around midnight, reach the park entrance by 12:15, and walk through to the middle school exit since it was the most direct path to my neighborhood. One night in late October, I walked through the south entrance like always and immediately noticed someone sitting on one of the benches just inside the gate. This had never happened before. The park was always completely deserted at that hour, especially as the weather got colder. But there he was, just sitting there in the freezing darkness, staring at his phone. As I got closer, I could make out more details. He looked maybe mid-20s, stocky build with a shaved head and a thick beard. He wore a gray hoodie and dark jeans and had several visible tattoos on his neck. When I walked past, he looked up and watched me with this unsettling smile. I gave a quick nod and kept moving, trying not to show how uncomfortable I felt. He didn't say anything, just tracked me with his eyes as I hurried past. The next night, he was there again. Same bench, same position, same creepy smile. This pattern continued for 3 nights straight. On the 4th night, he wasn't on the bench, and I actually felt relieved until I heard footsteps behind me in the darkness. I spun around but saw nothing. The sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling followed me all the way through the park. I ran the rest of the way home. I managed to get rides home for the next couple weeks. But eventually I had to start walking again. That's when he started talking to me. The comments were sexual and explicit, always delivered in this calm, quiet voice that somehow made everything worse. He'd comment on my work uniform, on my body, on what he wanted to do. I tried to ignore him, tried to walk faster, but he was always there. Then one night everything escalated. I walked past him as usual while he made his disgusting comments. I was maybe 30 feet past the bench, completely surrounded by darkness, when I heard running footsteps. Before I could react, someone slammed into me from behind, and I hit the ground hard. The weight of him pinned me down, and I felt his breath on my neck as he whispered that I shouldn't fight, that he'd been planning this for weeks. His hands started moving and I heard his belt buckle, and that's when pure survival instinct kicked in. I twisted my head and bit down on his forearm as hard as I could. He screamed and loosened his grip just enough for me to shove him off and scramble to my feet. I ran toward my usual exit, but when I reached the gate, I found it chained shut. It had never been locked before, not once in 8 months. I could hear him behind me, shouting, getting closer. I sprinted toward the basketball court exit and found it partially open, just enough gap to squeeze through. I barely made it, feeling his hand grab at my jacket as I pulled myself through to the other side. I hid in the overgrown bushes near the court, watching through the leaves as he searched for me. What I saw next still haunts me. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the path, head tilted back, and I swear he was smelling the air like an animal tracking prey. After what felt like forever, he walked away down the dark path toward the main road. I waited 15 minutes before moving, then ran back through the park. The south gate was still chained, so I climbed over it. As I walked toward the school path, some instinct made me look back. He was standing at the gate, just standing there watching me. He laughed and called out that he'd catch me eventually, that it was only a matter of time. I called the police when I got home. They filed a report, but said without a better description or evidence there wasn't much they could do. The Parks Department claimed they never locked that gate. To this day, I wonder how he knew my schedule, how long he'd been watching me before that first night I noticed him. I quit the diner job the next week, and I've never walked through that park again. Growing up, my absolute favorite hangout spot was this massive bookshop called Chapter House. It was located in Portland, tucked right beside a Taco Bell in a strip mall near the waterfront. My parents had this tradition where they'd take me there every Saturday, and if I behaved well during the week, they'd let me pick out a couple of books, usually a graphic novel and something from the fiction section, then treat me and my sisters to tacos afterward. It was the highlight of my week, honestly. Most of the time, my father would drive me, but one particular weekend when I was around 13, Chapter House announced they were going out of business. Everything was marked down ridiculously low, like 70 to 90% off the original prices. My mother decided to take me instead since my dad was working. And I remember walking through those doors and seeing the chaos of the clearance sale. People everywhere grabbing armfuls of books. I made a beeline for the graphic novel section and started pulling volumes off the shelf, calculating in my head how many I could afford with my allowance now that they were only a couple dollars each. That's when this guy approached me. He started asking me what series I was collecting, making recommendations, acting really friendly about our shared interests. Looking back now, he had to have been at least 19 or 20, but at 13, I couldn't really gauge ages properly. I just knew someone older was paying attention to me, treating me like I mattered. I'd spent most of middle school getting picked on, so having anyone show genuine interest in talking to me felt amazing at the time. I didn't see the red flags. My mother actually noticed him talking to me. She glanced over, clearly registered that he was significantly older than me, but she didn't intervene. When he asked if he could have my number so we could talk more about books and comics, she just smiled and nodded when I looked at her for permission. I'd only had my cell phone for about 6 months at that point, so getting a text from a boy felt incredibly grown up and exciting. I scribbled my number on a receipt, loaded up my discounted books, and left that store on cloud 9 with my tacos in hand. The first couple of days, the texts seemed normal enough. He'd ask what I was reading, recommend other series, tell me about conventions he'd been to. But by day 3 or 4, things took a sharp turn, and he started bringing up sexual topics completely out of nowhere. And not just awkward teenage stuff. He was describing specific scenarios involving younger girls, situations without consent, really disturbing fantasies that he wanted to act out. I'm 31 now, and I understand that adults can have consensual role play in their relationships. But this wasn't that. This was a grown man telling a 13-year-old child explicit details about what he wanted to do to her. I'd been raised in a strict Baptist household, so the shame and fear I felt was overwhelming. I couldn't tell my parents without admitting I'd been having these conversations. The messages kept coming, dozens a day. He started saying he knew which neighborhood I lived in, that he'd driven by my school, that he could find me whenever he wanted. And it took me almost a week to figure out how to block his number. Remember, I was barely a teenager and smartphones weren't as intuitive back then. Blocking him didn't stop anything. Over the next 4 years, he found every single social media account I created. New Instagram profiles, different phone numbers when I upgraded, Facebook accounts under variations of my name. He always tracked me down within weeks. The messages continued with the same disturbing content, the same threats about knowing where I was. I became paranoid about posting anything with identifiable locations. I stopped going to that strip mall entirely, terrified I'd run into him. I'm relieved to say I haven't received a single message from him in over a decade now. I moved across the country for college and never looked back. The distance helps me sleep at night, and knowing there's an entire continent between us now, but I still think about how differently things could have gone, how a simple trip to a closing bookstore sale nearly destroyed my teenage years. That place I once loved became the source of years of fear, all because someone saw a vulnerable kid and decided to take advantage. I'm writing this down because it's been just over 12 months since everything finally went quiet. This nightmare started back in 2017 in a small town in Oregon where I'd enrolled in a community ceramics workshop as part of a day program. I was 23 at the time, but honestly pretty sheltered. I'd taken extra time finishing my education due to some learning differences, and I was just starting to figure out independence. The workshop attracted an interesting crowd, to put it mildly. Not exactly supportive or kind people. Looking back, I wasn't great either. Being around that toxicity made me worse. The whole thing started over something incredibly stupid: leftover clay supplies. The instructor was clearing out old materials, and several of us grabbed what we could before it hit the dumpster. Yet I took the last few containers of porcelain slip. That's when Rebecca showed up. She made quite an entrance, blocking a doorway while our instructor was moving equipment. When asked to move, Rebecca literally said, "Do you know who I am? I'm a renowned ceramist." The instructor wasn't impressed. But Rebecca quickly gathered admirers from the workshop who treated her like she was somebody important. Her real agenda, though, was hunting down her supplies. During this search, Rebecca did something that should have been my warning. She started smelling everyone's clay. She'd mixed some kind of scented oil into hers so she could literally sniff out her property. While doing this, she casually mentioned she'd been institutionalized for stalking a former classmate over stolen art supplies. And she even showed me security footage on her phone, footage her father had obtained through government connections, which seemed highly illegal. She also told me about messages she'd been sending to a well-known sculptor because divine voices told her he'd advance her career. The whole time she stared without blinking, like she thought it made her look intense and artistic. I was terrified but couldn't figure out how to return the slip without making things worse. She threatened to get the program director fired if she couldn't search every room. When she finally found everything, she left it all in a storage closet, saying she'd return whenever she felt like it to check on it, and would sue Tay if anything went missing. I thought that was the end of it. 2 years later, and I enrolled in a year-long ceramics certificate program at the same place. I'd completely forgotten about Rebecca. During a cleanup, someone found her old supplies again, now mostly dried out and unusable. I grabbed 1 container of burgundy glaze, not remembering where it came from. Then one afternoon, Rebecca appeared and started smelling people's materials again. I didn't even recognize her at first. When she interrogated me about why my glaze smelled like hers, I was confused. I threw the container away. It had separated anyway. And that's when my life became a living hell. Rebecca became convinced I'd re-enrolled specifically to steal from her. She recruited others to harass me. One evening, a large man she'd enlisted physically attacked me in the studio while Rebecca watched from a corner and alternating between fake tears and smiling. Someone else smashed my phone. When I asked Rebecca why, she said, "So you'll know I can hurt you whenever I want." She started wearing burgundy clothing everywhere, telling me she wanted me to think of her every time I saw that color, something she'd seen in a film. She placed someone at my table for weeks with a phone on speaker, silently listening to my conversations. When Rebecca finally revealed this, she said, "I heard a voice from heaven telling me it's my divine purpose to monitor you and ensure you behave properly." The harassment escalated. One night I was cornered outside my apartment by 3 people I didn't know. I called 911, terrified I was going to die. When police arrived, the officer greeted the woman who'd orchestrated it, Sophia, like an old friend. I screamed for help. Now, he ignored me. She told him everything was fine. He said he looked forward to seeing her around town. Then he left. I woke up the next morning on the ground with a head injury. When I called for an ambulance and mentioned the officer had abandoned me, the dispatcher became angry, accused me of slandering her colleague, and hung up. I tried filing a police report, but the officer said he'd heard about me and refused. I ended up in a psychiatric facility. Rebecca had someone admitted as a patient so she could visit and continue the harassment. She had people follow me, park outside my home, steal small items like keys and scarves to mess with my head. Another movie tactic. She'd call pretending to be conducting surveys to extract personal information. She recruited people by giving them substances and then threatening to report them if they didn't comply. I learned she'd won a major art prize worth about $50,000, which funded everything. Her own family had cut contact because she'd been doing this since adolescence. I asked her once why she was doing this. She said, "To punish you." I asked for how long. She said, "As long as I decide." Then about a year ago, it just stopped. I don't know why. Maybe she ran out of people to manipulate, or maybe someone finally reported her successfully. I'm still afraid it'll start again. I've lost all faith in getting help from authorities. Rebecca, let's never meet again.